So I want to start this conversation with gratitude and with acknowledgement of our ancestors that have also walked this path, and those ancestors from different lineages. The words we know as Vision Quest has been part of a larger network of what we'd call Rites of Passage initiatory journeys that have been done all over the world throughout time and history. And I just want to give acknowledgement and honor to these ancient ways, these old ceremonies that have been done by many people. And also remind each of us that if you could far enough to where you found those old indigenous ways, you would find versions of this experience, some form of an initiatory passage that was done back there. So in gratitude and honor and deep thanks to the ancestors that through their prayerful diligence enable us to be here and have this conversation. And moving from there, what is it that calls people to this type of initiatory experience? Why does someone do this? Over a lifetime, I've really come to believe that the calling is something that really rises up from within, and it will take form in our lives either consciously and intentionally or unconsciously and unintentionally. So this call to initiation, I believe, is something that's in our bones, in our DNA, and at different times in our life will rise up asking to be attended to. In that poem by David White, he mentions the question. And that reminds me of, I think it was originally Carl Jung, and recently Joanna Macy put it back on my radar. This quote that says, there's one great question that runs like a thread through everyone's life. And if you find it, you are very fortunate. And I would add to that, that may it be a question that carries you across your life, something that it takes a good while to live into, those kind of questions. And so going up on the sacred mountain, and that's a phrase I use for the initiatory journey, the quest. Similar to why the Lakota say "Aho Matakoyasin," or the Cherokee may say "Aho Mateo," and it's a reference to a translation meaning all my relations. The ceremony and ritual of any kind is for all their relations, not just for themselves, but for their people. And so when I say their people, I mean the human and non-human people, the living and the non-living people. So that going out on the mountain, going on the quest was to go into an experience to activate the memories of the connection to the gift that you came into this world with. And then in activating that, begin to move in your life in such a way as to deliver that gift to your communities, to your families, to the world, really. And so it's a little bit of a framework. There's an indigenous, what I consider a cross-indigenous understanding of, or cross-culturally indigenous understanding that that we would have made agreements with our ancestors about a medicine or a gift that we're coming into this world to deliver. And that in so doing, we would make certain agreements with certain ancestors that carried a similar frequency of energy that we carry in order to help us deliver that gift. And that the initiatory passages that then we encountered once here were designed to activate the memory of those agreements and the awakening of that medicine, that gift. Usually thought of as something kind of a coming of age ceremony. But in reality, a vision quest or a walkabout or any form of going into the wilderness could be done at any stage of one's life for different reasons. And Just want to share some of those with you about the, here's some of the reasons that one might be called to the quests, or called to the initiatory descent. So for personalized and meaningful ritual and ceremony to facilitate and mark or celebrate various life passages, needed shift in consciousness required to enter into new life stations and responsibilities, to move through periods of physical or spiritual crises, to assist the family in the raising of youth, the seeking of spiritual guidance for self and community, clarify and strengthen one's personal medicine and gifts, to awaken your personal mythology, to assist in the understanding of roles and responsibilities of men and women in the village, to honor and connect with your own sacred traditions and teaching, to awaken your medicine for your community and your ancestors, to heal wounds of separation from yourself, community, nature, and spirit, and to receive the guidance and blessings of the elders in your community. So those are some of the things that could call one to this experience. You know, some of the thresholds and changes we go through are not really just, most of them are not developmental. You know, we think of, again, coming of age, but periods of any change of life station, you know, decision to have a child, the death of a loved one, a divorce, or a marriage, anything that one wants to mark with ceremony and ritual could be a reason and intent for going to the sacred mountain, to speak of it mythologically, this going on quest. And to awaken really more clearly a connection to yourself. There's this understanding I've gained through the years that the degree that one has become separated from their personal mythology, from their personal gift or medicine that they carry, is equivalent to the degree that they have turmoil in their lives. Some of the reasons of what calls people to the quest. And I'm curious also if there are things maybe with the alumni or even with the others that are on the line with us, that, you know, what do you notice that called you to the experience? Was it an awakening or was it trouble? Trouble has a way of calling us to these experiences. So I want to open up a little bit and see if anybody want to share something about, and briefly share, since we have a limited time, about what did call you to your experience, or what calls you now to consider such a thing.
Love to. So I actually did a grief ritual with Kedar and like a mini weekend event. And during that ceremony, I opened up to this place of the mother within me calling and letting me know that it was time to let go of my maiden self. And I had a lot of wounding around my maiden. So I got called to the quest for a type of an awakening where my maiden self was ready to be put to rest, to do sort of a grief ritual with her, and then step into this mother form.
Saying earlier that the history of it is cross-cultural. I'd say, you know, among almost every culture in history has traditions and initiations or rites of passage in the wilderness by which individuals confirm the attainment of new life stations, like manhood or womanhood, the elder years, other important life decisions and changes. You know, we might think of the wonder year, the pilgrimages of the vision quest, the underworld journey of the great matriarch deities, the walkabouts and the Aboriginal dream time. And also it's embedded, I'd say it's really deeply embedded in mythological consciousness with the fasting prophets of Judeo-Christianity and the questing ancestors, as I say, of the Aboriginal Dreamtime, the pilgrimages of the Buddha and Muhammad, and the medieval knights on their quest for the Holy Grail. Of course, Native Americans such as Crazy Horse and Black Elk and many others. So this, and we can also think of all the major religions of the world began really with somebody going into the wilderness and for a period of time by themselves and fasting and spending time in prayer. The common elements of the initiatory passage are those: fasting, solitude, and exposure to the natural world. I think a lot of times when I talk with people and they hear the word vision quest, they tend to think mainly of the time that you're out on the land by yourself. And that's what's called the threshold phase. There are really several phases to the experience. And we mentioned what I consider the first one already, which would be the calling. Something happens in one's life to awaken either an unmet longing that they recognize has been there for a while, or awaken the desire for something new and different, or it comes through tragedy or illness or challenge, this kind of calling. And then once one commits to the calling or commits to the ceremony, they enter into what's called the severance phase of the quest. So Daniel mentioned that that we're taking out the training group in about 9 days on a quest, and so they're very much in the severance phase. And the severance phase is well. Here's a good way to think about it. If you think of life beginning generally, if we think of life beginning with birth and ending with death, rites of passage, initiatory passages flip that around. And so the initiatory passage begins with a death and ends with a birth. And so it really reverses that dynamic. So in preparing for the initiatory journey, one enters what's called the severance phase or the death lodge. And so that the time of preparation is as if preparing for one's own death. Cleaning up their lives, what needs to be made right, what words need to be exchanged and with whom, what old stories about myself or others do I need to simply put down, so that as we approach the threshold phase, we're beginning to let go of all these old stories of ourselves that have run our lives or run our perceptions of others' lives. So that we can come to the quest, as I say, with our palms empty and our hearts open. And so this preparation is really as if preparing for one's own death on that ceremonial threshold passage. And then there's the arrival at the land. And that's what going out on the land is what most people think of when they hear those words, vision quest or vision fasting. And that's what's called the threshold phase. That's, that's Jesus's 40 days and 40 nights in the wilderness. That's the Buddha's time that he spent under the Bodhi tree. That's Muhammad's time that he went up on the mountain. Again, in the Old Testament, it's filled with prophets that quested in the wilderness. And that's the threshold phase is that period of time once you have severed from familiar places, faces, and things, that you go out into the wilderness to meet Creator and have those encounters. And so in this particular process, that's 4 days and 4 nights. We can have one for each of the seasons or one for each of the directions on the medicine wheel. And that's the period of the threshold phase. And in that threshold phase, one hopefully comes to a point of surrender, even surrendering to all the ideas and the reasons that you thought you were doing this for. These ancient initiatives were sometimes called an ordeal, and they were meant to be somewhat of an ordeal because they were not designed for the initiate to be able to get through simply by their own willpower. They had to reach out to something greater than their self resources. And so it's at that moment when one has reached that place of surrender that they begin to reach out. And as the as the Lakota have a word called hemblecha, and it translates more like a verb, meaning to cry for a vision. We have this way in our language to use a lot of nouns, which creates a lot what's called a dead language often. And so in indigenous cultures they use probably 3 times as many more verbs than we have in our language. And by doing so, it keeps a language and an engagement with your experience. Things become living and moving and active. Even names were more like verbs sometimes. And so this idea of to cry for a vision was the act of surrender in the quest. And so that's the threshold phase. And then then there's the return phase, the coming back from the children, coming back into your village. Maybe, as in this case, joining others that have gone out there with you on the mountain, and together you come back in. And then we have the council, what's called the Council of Elders, where we sit and we deeply listen to the stories of one's encounters and experiences out in the wilderness. And then we mirror back to the person what we hear in your stories, what we call forming your own personal mythology. These are the things we hear. And both the strengths and the challenges, and help the person begin to weave an understanding of their encounters in wild in such a way that it tells a story. And not just a story of what happened in the past 4 days, but also a map that guides them forward, that names certain strengths and resources, or maybe even challenges that they might encounter. But also name more clearly in the story the personal medicine and gift that we see that this person carries. And so another concept of that the gift that you carry will only get delivered if you do it. So it's different than this better and less than thinking of our culture, where people are in competition to do the same thing. And this way, you can't be better the same way you can't be less. You can only be you or not you. And so doing that, these initiatory passages were again designed to wake up that connection to yourself more fully. So the phases: the calling phase, the severance phase, the threshold phase, the return phase, and then a final one I call the incorporation phase, which can last decades in terms of how do you begin to incorporate into your life the mysteries and the mythology of what happened. And always encourage people to take a journal with them, because the unfolding of that story that you journal can inform you literally for decades. I did my first vision quest 25 years ago, and even a couple of years ago, I had this awareness that came from that time on the mountain back then that I had never put together, that made all of a sudden a lot of other things fall into place. And so that the incorporation phase, how do we bring these experiences back into our lives, into our communities, into our families, and leave it here.
Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about my my Death Lodge process, and there was a place where I did a lot of work around healing for my ancestors and healing my maternal lineage. And so my mom actually moved here this year after my quest was complete. We had started talking about what she was going to do at the last phase of her life, because she's 72 now. And one of the things that we discussed was, would they want to move closer to us? And what I felt like happened during my quest is I started doing that healing work for my maternal lineage, and it healed a lot of places between me and my mother. And as a result of that, she ended up, her and my father moved here a few months ago. And I continued to do that work, and I'm watching the ripple effect of what happens when we do our work out through the Vision Quest, and then how that then affects our lives after we return back home to our people. And so it's been a beautiful process to witness and be a part of, and integrate in many ways.
Yeah, so and I was talking about them before, just talking about the general framework of the initiatory passage. So to say a few words specifically about the program encampment, this village encampment that we put together. So it's 11 days or 12 days for staff and apprentices. It's offered in different locations. As you heard Serena and Daniel speak of, they came here to the Asheville area in the mountains here. I know Mariana spoke of the one that's going to be happening over in Wales next spring in May. And there'll be others here in the Asheville area as well next year. But in the way that I put it together, I call it a 4-phase initiatory process. So there's the preparation phase. Once you commit to the journey and commit to the process, then we begin having conversations. And sometimes, depending on when somebody commits, these conversations can be, even a year in advance. And for others, it may be a month or two. And we start talking about ceremonies of preparation. And there are several ceremonies of preparation that I guide people through even before we arrive. And then once arriving on the land with the other questers and the staff and apprentices, the first phase would be what I call the finding your place on the wheel. Working with a medicine wheel and being able to identify our strengths and our challenges. Where are those areas of the wheel that I feel confident and strong in? What areas are areas of challenge or edges for me? And so there's that way of kind of framing my experiences through this medicine wheel work, or what's called finding your place on the wheel. And then we move through that to what's called Death Lodge. Now, Death Lodge as a term refers to that, mostly that severance phase. And if you lived in a village that honored death passages, it would not be unusual that if one was in a state of departure, that they would go to a place called the Death Lodge. It would be like that, and you would go there in order to finish your life and make right what needed to be made right, so you can have as what's said is have a good death. And to have a good death means that you lived well. So this, so the Death Lodge simulation, from that in preparation for a ceremonial death and rebirth, is a period of time over 2 days where every quester in the group that's questing will have the full attention of the circle to do a ritual process or Death Lodge work. usually involving various elements. It's hard to say what would unfold. It's more that they just, in stating the attention and they claim the time and circle, that things begin to rise up, and I guide them through a process that's very organic for them, of dealing with whatever comes up in Death Lodge for them to deal with before they go out on the mountain. And this is done with the full support of everyone in the circle. Often we do elemental rituals, may be a part of that change and transition and healing in that moment. And so I say we're in that Death Lodge part of the encampment for 2 solid days, where we're doing that work with those people. Then after Death Lodge, we transition to the next day, where we have what's called the physical plane meeting. We talk about basic elements and aspects of wilderness safety, how to take care of your fasting for 4 days and nights, what's our safety system, what's called the stone pile, and how there's a check system in place through having stone pile partners where you don't actually see each other physically, but there's a way to touch in and know that each other is well and okay during the 4 days. And so giving you that information about how to deal with all the things that could happen, and what to do if, in terms of your solo time. Then we send people out on the land and have them find their spot, where they're going to be, where's their questing spot, their power spot. And I often give people instructions is that when you go out on the land, think of it if you were going out there to take your last breath, to have your last stand, what is the spot that calls to you most deeply for that? And that would probably be the place to do your quest. Then people come back in after finding their spot, and we figure out where everybody's going to be, and I plot them on a map so I know where everybody is, and the staff knows where everybody is. And then we begin preparations for the sweat ceremony. And so the night before everybody goes out, we do a sweat lodge ceremony. And that's the last thing we do that night. And then the next morning we get up. The staff is up before sunrise, and then we get the questers up. And we do what's called a threshold ceremony. And this is a ceremony that's done at sunrise in order to then send the questers out for their 4 days and nights. So we have that threshold ceremony and do a blessing and for each person going out on the land. And then we send them out from the community fire with their stone pile partner. And then once they get to a central location, then they build a stone pile that they can check in, and then they go to their own spot. So they're not seeing each other during that time. What happens at base camp is we tend fire. So the staff are sitting by the fire. Somebody is at that fire 24 hours a day, speaking prayers and for those that are on the mountain. And the staff rotate throughout the night to sit with the fire, so that anytime during those 4 days when you may be feeling challenged or struggle, if you visualize that fire, you will see one of us sitting there, holding space for you. So that goes on at base camp while you're out on the mountain, out in the wilderness. On the 5th morning, you return after 4 days and nights, and we do another threshold ceremony to bring you back into the village. And then we have a big feast, a celebratory meal where we feed everyone. Usually journaling or resting or swimming if there's a river, and just kind of settling back in. It's a very tender time where people return. And then generally after lunch, we begin into the Council of Elders, the story circle, where we begin listening to each person's story of their experience out on the land, out in the wilderness. And following their their telling of their story, then each person in the circle will mirror back to them what we hear in their story. Over the years, I've developed the process of actually offering a digital recording of our feedback, so that later, after the encampment's over, we send that to each person where they have a recording of everybody commenting on your experience. We don't record your story, of course, but we send that, so that becomes another way to stay connected. So the story circle goes on for 2 half days. And then following that, we shift into the crafting of usually a medicine pouch. Could be a medicine bundle. We make something. One of the staff usually brings a deer hide or something, and each person will make something for themselves as a medicine piece to take from the quest. And then we have a celebration that night. Sometimes that night or the next morning we do what's called the giveaway ceremony. And then we do a story and talk about re-entry and how do you carry this back. It can be quite a challenge sometimes to go from being deeply connected in the wilderness and deeply connected into that village life and in that solitude of the quest to how do you navigate yourself back into a life that maybe you don't quite fit in as well as you used to. And that's part of the transition, or maybe back into a life with a lot of inspiration that is now carrying you in this direction. And so we spend some time talking about how to do that. And then we have closing ceremonies, and then depart from the land. And so that period of time is 11 days. And there's a lot of, as you hear, there's a lot of rituals and different things that happen in that 11-day encampment other than just the 4 days and nights that people go out on the land. We also work with each person individually to give them suggestions of things that certain ceremonies that we would offer to them that they might want to consider doing while they're out on the land. And these will be things from what we've noticed with them and the other piece is all of that preparation. The first 5 days at base camp is to help you formulate a clear intention about why you're doing the ceremony. Why are you going out there? Are you going out, maybe, as Daniel said, to mark this stepping into manhood, or this transition from a career, or this putting down these old stories about yourself? Whatever it is you're going out there to mark. So we help each person come up with a statement of marking that on that first threshold ceremony, when you step up to the fire and we smudge you off, we'll ask you, what is it that you wish to mark with this ceremony? And you'll have that statement. And then we'll ask you, who or what would you like to dedicate this ceremony to? And you may have a statement there as well about a dedication. So all of that happens at that first threshold ceremony. So as you can hear, there's 4 phases to the process. This is finding your place on the wheel, death lodge, and sweat lodge, and threshold, and then the return and the stories. So it's quite full. And so that's the particular encampment that we do, whether it's over here or in California, in the UK right now. So we end with this poem called Desert. It's strange how deserts turn us into believers. I believe in walking in a landscape of mirages because you learn humility. I believe in living in a land of little water because life is drawn together. And I believe in the gathering of bones as a testament to the spirits that have moved on. If the desert is holy, it is because it is a forgotten place that allows us to remember the sacred. Perhaps that is why every pilgrimage to the desert is a pilgrimage to the self. It is strange how deserts turn us into believers. I believe in walking in a landscape of mirages because you learn humility. I believe in living in a land of little water because life is drawn together. And I believe in the gathering of bones as a testament to the spirits that have moved on. If the desert is holy, it is because it is forgotten. It is a forgotten place that allows us to remember the sacred. Perhaps that is why every pilgrimage to the desert is a pilgrimage to the self.